Thanks, Fred. Once again, please help me welcome Phil Gliebe from the Division III up in Dayton there. This is going to be Ron, Fred, and I got a little sample of this on Thursday when we did our practice, and this is going to be a very interesting presentation. So thank you, Phil, and I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Russ. Well, I consider it an honor to be able to give a clinic to Division 8. I've always had a lot of respect for Division 8 folks and have really enjoyed the MCR conventions when they were held by Division 8. This is a presentation which I put together to focus just on locomotives in narrow gauge. I'm a member of a modular group called the Great Lakes HOn30 group, and the group models main narrow gauge only using 30-inch gauge track instead of 24-inch, which all the main narrow gauge railroads were. And what I found was that there wasn't a whole lot of rolling stock or locomotives that you could purchase outright that were HOn30. And so I started looking at kit bashing or scratch building my own, both rolling stock and locomotives. This presentation is going to focus pretty much on locomotives. However, I've been a member of the Great Lakes group since I think 2004. It was when I joined, and over the years, I've been realizing that as I age, both my eyes and my dexterity with my hands is getting not as good as it used to be. And I started looking at O-scale narrow gauge, and in particular ON30 rather than HOn30. And I started experimenting with building kits or kit bashing existing locomotives in that scale to see how I liked it. So this is going to be a summary of what I've been doing in both HOn30 as well as more recently in ON30. So we'll continue on from there. My motivation, why do I do this? Well, I really like the, not so much the big, long Colorado narrow gauge railroads, but more like the industrial and the funky looking locomotives that have been used in industrial, like logging and mining and quarrying and so on. So I've pretty much focused on that kind of narrow gauge system rather than a very large narrow gauge system. And I find I have a lot of fun coming up with locomotives that other people don't have on their layouts. So this is basically why I'm doing it. I'd like to say a few words about scale and gauge and then go right into the HOn30 locomotives I have put together, and then the ON30 locomotives, and then give you some parting thoughts. I kind of said much of what's on this chart right here, but one of the things about building motive power for a narrow gauge branch line or existing standard gauge layout is I like to build models that aren't available off the shelf. And with HOn30, which uses N-scale track gauge, you can use N-scale mechanisms as a basis for your HO narrow gauge locomotives. And the same thing holds for ON30. ON30 uses HO rail gauge, so you can use HO mechanisms to build O-scale narrow gauge locomotives. I try to pick mechanisms that are reliable, especially for HOn30, because being able to switch and do operations is dependent on having a good, reliable, slow-running mechanism. And I try to design them so that they're easy to take apart and maintain, and using simple tools and materials, because I don't have a machine shop, so I have to rely on simple tools and materials. Okay, HOn30 is HO scale, 187 scale, with a 30-inch track gauge, and N gauge track is approximately 30 inches in full scale when you use an HO scale factor. And similarly, ON30 is basically O scale narrow gauge with a scaled 30-inch track gauge, and it turns out that HO gauge track is approximately 30 inches in full scale when using an O scale factor. It's kind of fun to build a narrow gauge locomotive in these scales, and that's what this clinic is all about. I'll first go over some of the locomotives in HOn30 that I've put together. I mentioned that I belong to the Great Lakes HOn30 module group, which models main narrow gauge railroads early in the 1900s. I try to build steam locomotives for fitting the modeled time area when I'm running on their layout, but once in a while I build some diesel switchers when we're stretching the time era. The first one is an 060 tank engine. I began with a Chivers Fine Lines Baldwin 040 tank conversion kit that uses a Bachmann N-scale 040 switcher mechanism. However, the 040 mechanism that Bachmann put out, which was like maybe 20 years ago now, I don't think they make them anymore, was not very reliable. I have one locomotive that still has that mechanism and it still runs, but it's not good for switching. It's pretty much an exhibit layout locomotive that just runs a train round and round the layout. So I decided to adapt a lifelike 060 tank engine mechanism instead. This is a picture of a box of parts that I got with this Chivers Fine Lines conversion kit. And then you can see in the photo the N-scale locomotive that I used to give the donor mechanism. It consists of a bunch of cast metal parts and brass sheet to build the cab and the cab roof. And the cab is essentially an outer U-shaped cab and an inner U-shaped cab on the other end. And you slide the two together and glue or solder them, and you'll get a cab that has all of the window frames and so on in relief. So first of all, the chassis that is supplied with the conversion kit doesn't fit the Bachmann or the lifelike mechanism, so I built one myself out of styrene that will exactly fit over the mechanism. I took the cab and slid it apart by one door width so that it would cover the Bachmann or the lifelike mechanism, and then that gave me a cab with a door on the side rather than an end cab door. I made new end beams from styrene strip. I used microtrains knuckle couplers, added a coal bunker to the rear of the cab from sheet styrene, and let's see, Seem to be moving too fast here. Added a bell, whistle, air pump, headlight, cab window glazing, and so on. I used all CAA to put it all together. I never soldered anything or welded anything. And this is the final result. You can see the cab is a little longer than the original kit intended in order to cover the motor that you can see inside the cab windows. And it runs pretty well. Hadn't had any troubles with it so far. Railway Recollections is a one-man band company that offers cast resin conversion kits for various locomotive kit to build HOn30 locomotives from an N-scale mechanism. And in fact, I used another lifelike N-scale locomotive to donate the chassis and running mechanism for this conversion set. So I just built it per the instructions, and this is a picture of it as is. I believe I added my own headlight and bell. But I went one step further and added a foot plate to the cab and built a four-wheel tender from styrene and wood. Used a single N-scale truck for the four-wheel tender, added engineer and fireman, and then built a cab interior with a firebox and boiler from styrene to cover up the electric motor mechanism. So this is that same locomotive now with the extended foot plate and the four-wheel tender. It's like actually a passenger car truck that I use for that. And then I put a boiler and steam dome inside and a driver and a fireman. By the way, the caboose here is is it a KD that builds a four-wheel caboose in HO scale. So I narrowed it and made it fit HOn30. The next one is in a diesel switcher. Again, I used the lifelike 060 mechanism. I just removed the drive rods and cylinders and let it be a side rod mechanism. And built a styrene platform around it, added the microtrains couplers and so on, and that becomes the basis for any superstructure that I would want to put on it. I used a Funero and Camerlengo diesel flat car load for the cab and hood, and then added my own end beams and steps. And this was written up in, I believe, Railroad Model Craftsman. Yeah, March 2011, if you'd like to look that up. There's the Funero and Camerlengo cast resin hood and cab. I then added some details like handrails on the hood and steps on the side and so on. I painted it orange with a Milwaukee Road emblem on it because there was actually a narrow gauge railroad called Bellevue and Cascade in Iowa in the early 1900s that had a diesel switcher such as this in the closing days before Milwaukee Road bought them out. Well, he had bought them out, but hadn't shut them down yet. So that's why I chose this color scheme, and then added my own handrails and sand dome and headlight and so on. This mechanism seems to work pretty well. One thing I noticed was that these side steps stuck out to the side too far, and they would hit my switch machines when I went through a turnout. So I had to narrow them. I didn't then build twin Plymouths. I was inspired to build this as a potential, could have been replacement for the old steam locomotives used by the main narrow gauges railroads. So I took two Bachmann MDT Plymouth N-scale mechanisms and a Funero and Camerlengo flat car load shell for each of them. Again, this was written up in Railroad Model Craftsman, February 2014. Again, I start out with the mechanism. I build a styrene platform to go around it precisely, and then add the superstructure to that. In this case, the locomotive cab did not entirely cover up the motor of the mechanism, so I added a little extension to the cab in the back, and then actually later put a toolbox on the back over that. Here's the two locomotives. I painted them Pullman green, which is kind of like a Maine color scheme, like Maine Central or one of those. And I numbered them number 5 and 6 for Bert and Ernie, respectively. I don't know if you know this, but Bert and Ernie are not only Muppets, but in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, the policemen and the cab drivers are named Bert and Ernie. So there's a picture of these twin Plymouths pulling a train on our Great Lakes group layout. And they seem to be well matched. And even though these are DC, not DCC locomotives, they seem to be well matched and pull the train along pretty easily. I tend to look at what's going on in the rest of the world modeling wise, and there's a railway modeler magazine published by Pico in England that has a lot of interesting things in narrow gauge. And they had an article about building an easy switch engine using the Bachmann MDT mechanism. So I decided I would follow their directions and build one. Here's a picture of the article out of the magazine. There's the Bachmann MDT switcher. And in this case, I built the cab per their instructions out of sheet styrene. And so it shows you how I've laid out the cab walls on a sheet of 20,000 styrene, and then assembled the walls, attached them to the basic shell, use the shell hood as is, I had to cut off the existing cab above the window line, and then this shell fit over the rest of the cab. Here's some intermediate pictures where I've added side rails using styrene channel, and it shows window ledges and end beams made from styrene, and I use some nut bolt washer castings and so on to add detail. Radiator grill was made out of styrene and use slats in the radiator grill. So here's the shell completed and painted, and there's the mechanism that it goes over. I had to amputate the legs off of my engineer figure to get it to fit, but you can't tell from looking through the cab window. I made an exhaust system out of styrene tubing and a headlight and a horn. So a couple of shots of it. I painted it in typical British color scheme, green and with red end beams. Climax, I did build an HOn30 Climax, and there was an article in Model Railroader about taking an MDC roundhouse HO Climax and modifying it to make it a little more realistic and less distorted in appearance. And it idea came to me, I could do this in HOn30 because I didn't have the limitations of the old MDC roundhouse mechanism being so bulky. So I decided to use a 4-axle diesel chassis for this Climax, and it allows me to modify the body shell, kit bashed, if you will, to make it look more realistic. This was published in NMRA magazine in November of 2011. So here we are again. I've got a chassis. I build a platform out of styrene that just fits around the chassis. And then from there, I add the superstructure. I targeted, this was a Kato RS2 mechanism, which runs like a dream. I targeted a 7-foot body width as representative of main narrow gauge. Here's the original body, and you can see how the boiler is way up in the air relative to the cab, and there's this huge fuel wood pile thing. All that is because it had a huge cast metal chassis that had to get covered up. Well, I don't need to cover all that much up, so I decided to slice and dice this casting, took off the sides, cut apart the boiler and the fuel area, and narrowed everything to give a 7-foot scale width when the sides are reattached. And so here is my version, and there's the original HO scale version with the boiler way up in the air. I added a pilot deck, and you see the boiler sits down close so that you can see out of the front cab windows now. I fabricated cab front walls and end platforms, beams, added a tank ladder, handrails, narrowed the roof to fit. It shows a little better some of the detail. I added a ladder from my scrap box, which happened to have been made out of orange styrene. And you can see how I've considerably lowered the water tank and fuel area. I chose coal instead of wood. And this is the final version of that. The only thing I don't like about this is the front end overhang is more than I would have liked. But other than that, proportionally, it looks much more like a Climax than the original HO MDC roundhouse kit did. I decided to do a 4-axle center cab diesel. So I took a Atlas GP9 N-scale chassis and 2 Caterpillar switcher shells and scratch built the styrene frame. Again, there's the N-scale mechanism from a GP9. I took 2 Caterpillar shells and cut the cab off of one end and used the hood for the other hood for the center cab. Again, laid out a chassis to fit over the mechanism. And here you see the mechanism, and the slot that fits right over it is pretty tight fit. And then bordered it with channel, styrene channel. And here you see it all coming together. Then I added handrails and side steps, end beams from phosphor bronze wire. Again, I painted it a muted dark green to be reflective of being a main narrow gauge locomotive. Put headlights on both ends, horn on the roof, and trimmed all the rails in yellow. Okay, that's the end of the HOn30. Now I'd like to show some ON30 locomotives I've built. Like I said, I was interested in the fact that there were a lot of small-time manufacturers that were building conversion kits. So I've done several of these. I've done a 2-axle end cab switcher, a 4-axle center cab diesel. I took a Bachmann 042 tank engine and played around with it. I did an ON30 version of that railway modeler British design critter. I built a steam dummy, which I'll mention, and a 4-wheel Climax and a Class A Dunkirk. Again, these are all pretty much industrial switchers or industrial locomotives, logging locomotives of one kind or another. The ON30 2-axle end cab switcher uses a Bachmann HO 44-ton switcher power truck, and this is the older version of the Bachmann 44-ton switcher that used to have 2 motors, one in each truck, driving each truck. Well, it turns out electrically you can take them out and either one of them will run. You don't, they were not really connected except to light the headlights. So this end cab switcher was built from a Boulder Valley Models Mega Midget conversion kit. It is also cast resin. And it turns out Boulder Valley Models went out of business. So I can't recommend, unless you can find one at a train show or something, that you'd be able to build the same model. But it was the first one I built maybe 10 years ago. And I got all excited when it was done because I could actually see all the details I put in it. This is the final product. I never took intermediate pictures of this, which I regret, but you can see it uses the Bachmann hood, the Bachmann 44-ton switcher hood, and then the cab is a part of the kit and the chassis frame is part of the kit. I didn't have to build a frame for it. I added my own exhaust system made out of styrene tubing and bell and horn and headlight, and built my own radiator out of styrene strip. Turns out that the kit came with interior details, so I put those in with an engineer, and like I said, I was very happy with this result because I could see all the details easier and it seemed to run pretty smoothly, and it was a lot of fun to build. So that started me off on ON30. I next decided to do a 4-axle center cab diesel like I did for HOn30, and I used a Bachmann mechanism again, the 44-ton switcher model, but I used the later model with a single motor. And actually, this one happened to have DCC, so I could run this on DCC if I wanted. Again, it was a Boulder Valley Models conversion set, and I added a lot of details to it. This kind of illustrates exactly how I did it. Here's the original Bachmann 44-ton locomotive. removed the cab and the end beams and skirts and so on. I built a deck around the hoods that were left. Then I added the Boulder Valley model end beams. I used styrene channel for side beams. Then built the Boulder Valley model's cab, which was a flat-sided sides, ends, and roof that you glued together. Then added my own headlight shrouds and radiator grills from styrene strip. So that's kind of the evolution of how this was built. Here's the final result. I added exhaust pipes from styrene tubing. Handrails were made from phosphor bronze wire. Added a crew, horn and bell, toolbox and so on, coils of wire, et cetera, et cetera. So that was that locomotive. Here's what you can do with just purchasing a ready-to-run Bachmann HOn30 locomotive. This happened to be a 042 steam locomotive, which I then repainted. I cut off the end steps and shortened the couplers because I thought it looked odd with having these couplers sticking way out. Put shorter couplers in. Added some details like a bell cord. Painted the side panels to look like wood and added a wood load for the fuel. Dull coated everything, added a driver, and did some dry brush weathering. So that's what you can do with a ready-to-run model. You don't really have to scratch build or kit bash to get a nice little steam locomotive. And by the way, these come with DCC2 also. So here's how I did the Bachmann MDT Plymouth conversion, similar to the way the railway model article switcher for HOn30 was done, because they made an HO version of this MDT Plymouth in N scale. So I says to myself, I can do that in O scale. So we use the Bachmann MDT Plymouth HO chassis, and you can take the cab off. You don't have to cut it off because in HO scale, they're two separate parts. So I took everything apart here. And then I scratch built a new cab, and as it turns out, scratch built a lot more. Again, I laid out the parts. This time I used 40 thousandths thick styrene instead of 20 thousandths, and drew the cab parts on a sheet of styrene and then cut them out. You probably all know this trick, but since I had to cut a lot of window holes in these kit bashes that I did, I found it easier that if I score along the outline of the window, just score along it, but not cut all the way through, and then cut diagonals from one corner to the opposite corner, like this, and then cut the diagonals all the way through, but you don't have to go outside of the outline of the window. Then the triangles will just snap out, and it gives you a nice clean opening for the windows. You probably already know that trick though. At any rate, all the separate walls were made, and I trimmed all the door frames and window frames with styrene, made new end beams, added nut bolt washer castings and so on, and put styrene side rails on the original chassis. So here's the intermediate stage with side rails, end beams. I built a new radiator out of styrene. Then I built a grill for the styrene, and which I painted before gluing into the radiator frame. Again, out of styrene strip. Then I made out of styrene some brake shoes to glue to the sides of the chassis between the wheels. I added new doors to all the sides of the hood and used micro scale decals to louver the doors and little pieces of wire for the door handles, and built end steps out of styrene. Another intermediate picture, still needs a roof. So I built a roof frame that I could slip out of in case I needed to get inside the cab for anything. I also built new side frames out of styrene. Basically, they were constructed from strip and sections of tubing of various lengths and depths to simulate the journal boxes. And then this is the first for me, I soldered some brass strip together to make a grill guard. So here's the final product. I added an air tank made out of styrene tubing and strip, added a bell that I pirated from some other locomotive, again made an exhaust system out of styrene tubing, added handrails, there's the grill guard there, uncoupling levers, and some details. You can see the side frames that I built. And then this is next to the original HOn30 version, like father, like son. Steam dummy. I saw some photos on the internet of steam dummies, which are basically a steam locomotive in what I call horse trolley clothes. According to the internet, which of course always has truth, right? According to the internet, steam dummies were conceived as a way to hide the fact that it was a steam locomotive that was going along the city streets and scaring all the horses. And therefore, since it was disguised to look like a trolley car, they wouldn't get scared. I don't think that worked. Anyways, I decided to make one by kit bashing a Bantam Model Works crew speeder kit. I believe they're still in business, so you could probably try this yourself. And I used a Bachmann HOn30 Davenport gas mechanical locomotive mechanism. Here's some prototype examples of steam dummies. They actually look like a trolley car, but they are got a steam locomotive hidden inside. There's a logging one here. These look more streamlined over here. There's another one over here. So I took the gas mechanical and removed the cab. I eventually removed the hood also. I didn't use the hood either. And here's the laser kit for building the crew speeder, which is supposedly a gas mechanical crew speeder, but I decided to make it a steam dummy instead. So I built the kit per instructions, but I cut out the end doors so that I could put the doors in as partially open so you could look inside the cab. I also added gussets in the corners because I wanted to be able to remove the roof. You'll recall in my intro that I like to be able to take this thing apart if I have to fix the mechanism. I then decided to make a pseudo boiler and steam dome and smokestack to fit inside. So I built one out of styrene. It kind of looks like a lobster trap here, but then I wrapped it with styrene sheet and then used a backhead from some parts manufacturer on the one end and a steam dome, added handrails and so on, painted it grimy black, and it kind of looks like a boiler. And it fits over the mechanism so that when you look inside, you see this. I was even able to run wiring from the original mechanism to light the headlight here. And the body shell is bolted to the chassis with 256 screws drilled and tapped into the chassis. This boiler saddle tank just snaps into place, and the doors are glued in place open, and an engineer and controls are installed here. And then I put 80 screw nuts on the underside of these fillets so that I could screw down the roof and take it off if I needed to. So here's the final result. I added a whistle on the top made out of styrene tubing. A bell, smokestack actually came from that MDC roundhouse Climax that I butchered before. And added front and rear pilots, couplers, decals, coal bin, and so on. So if you look inside the cab, you'll see a bin full of coal. And here's a picture of it pulling a couple of ore cars. Okay, scratch-built four-wheel Climax. I was inspired by an article in Railroad Model Craftsman by Thomas York, and he had old photos of the first Climax Gold Bug locomotive. And he had used a Bachmann HOn30 trolley mechanism and built a frame and cab from it, over it, but in what I called G scale. In other words, he was like effectively full scale 18-inch gauge, but I decided I was going to do this in HOn30. So this is O scale 30-inch gauge. And I subscribe to a magazine called Narrow Gauge Down Under, which is published in Australia, and they published an article on this locomotive. So here I built a frame. This time I'm not using styrene, I'm using basswood. Built the entire frame out of basswood, including the decking. I scratch-built wheel pedestals by taking some brass strip and some styrene strip, and I took an HOn30 arch bar truck and cut it all up to get the journal boxes and springs, and then built the wheel pedestals out of those parts. And here you can see the chassis made out of basswood with its end beams, the wheel pedestals, and there's a section of a gear between these two cross beams here, as you'll see in a moment why I've done that. So I thought I would just show this part so far with a couple characters on here. I actually ran it on my HO scale layout to make sure it ran okay, and it runs fine. I then took an HOn30 log skidder, which is shown in this picture on the far left upper, and took it all apart I decided I would use the boiler as is pretty much. And I took the cylinders that were on each side of the log skidder frame and put them together to make a 2-cylinder Climax engine. So I made the parts out of styrene. Here's a picture of the engine. End view. I've got drive shaft and pistons going up and down, and I added some gears in there. I built a water tank out of sheet styrene. I used 40 thousandths thick styrene and then reinforced the corners with 1/8-inch square styrene so that when I rounded the corners, I'd still have a nice smooth surface. And then here's a picture with the boiler, which has been repainted, my pseudo Climax engine, and then the water tank. I then built the cab out of basswood strips. I first drew full size what the cab size should look like, and then I scanned it into a PDF file, and Adobe Reader gives you the opportunity to flip the image to give you a mirror image. So I flipped the image in Adobe Reader and then printed that out as well as the original. So I'd have right and left sides of the same drawing. I then cut all the parts out of styrene that were to go together on the cabs, and then put the drawings on a piece of foam board, and then covered that with wax paper, and then I was able to pin all the parts with straight pins and build both cab sides, which are shown here on the lower left-hand corner. I stained all the wood first. I didn't paint after it was done, but stained all the wood parts so that glue would still adhere, and put the two sides together and built the front piece by piece, and then the roof arches. And here you see the Climax locomotive and the gear, and it sort of looks like it meshes somewhere down here with the gear that's shown between these two cross pieces, and cobbled up some engine controls. And then you see the rest of the locomotive here. I added a headlight, a wood load in the back, or in the front, actually. The wood load's in the front. So that completes that story. My last locomotive to show is a Dunkirk. It was used building a Boulder Valley Models resin conversion kit, and it uses an Athearn Blue Box SW1200 switcher mechanism. The reason I even did this is I went to an operating session with a Wednesday morning group that I was going to before COVID, and the fellow there gave me this kit, said, I don't think I want this. See what you can do with it. So I took the kit home and put it on a stack of things to do someday. And then when COVID hit, I happened to be thinking I need something else to do. So I pulled this box out, and there were 9 bags of resin parts and about 20 pages of instructions, which I managed to wade my way through. So the chassis from the SW1200 is shown here. Remove the side trucks, and the kit gives you new side frames to put on to give it that arch bar, old-timey look. This is the chassis that came with the kit. Interestingly, many of the flat large flat pieces were warped, and I had to straighten them. And most times when I read about how to flatten resin kit parts, they say to dip it in boiling water and then put it on a flat surface and cover it with a heavy book or something. But I found that I could do it using a heat gun. I just had to be very careful not to get it too hot. So the kit gives you parts to make the water tank, the engine shroud, and the boiler, which I added. And here is the cab, which was the part. These were the parts that were the most warped. And I cut away the back end of the cab so I'd have an open area for the fuel load. And then here's the final locomotive assembled. I added some details like headlight, bell, front railing, stirrup steps, some tools, and engineer. Here's the view of the front end. I had a toolbox with tools in it, shovels and so on. And then there's the back end with the fuel load. And you can see the boiler right there and the engineer. And here's this locomotive pulling those same work cars plus a couple small four-wheel cars, including a caboose. So, couple things I thought I'd mention is, first of all, these mechanisms come and go. I mean, they're manufactured for a while and then they don't make them anymore and it's hard to find them. So you need to be flexible in designing a kit bash around a given mechanism so that if it breaks, can you get a new one, or you need to modify it to fit a different one? And also look for mechanisms that are smooth, slow running mechanisms so that if you want to do switching, they're easy to control. That's not so much an issue with HOn30 because a lot of HO mechanisms are pretty smooth running. It's more true with the really small end scale mechanisms. When I'm kit bashing something, I don't always have a plan to take me all the way to the end when I start. I usually cut and try, and I take one step at a time. And if I can't see how to go the next step, I usually set the project aside and kind of let it cook for a while in my mind, and then I usually get some idea that gets me past that. I always try to make the locomotive mechanisms easily removable and replaceable. I usually drill and tap with a pin vise to fasten things together so that I can take things apart again. As far as narrow gauge goes, hopefully much of this material is relevant to standard as well as a narrow gauge in terms of how to scratch build or kit bash. But regarding narrow gauge, you really don't need an entire narrow gauge layout. You can build a small branch line to your existing standard gauge layout, like a logging line or a quarry tram or whatever. On the other hand, if you have an N scale or HO scale standard gauge layout and are thinking of changing to something else, you could try HOn30 on your N scale track, or you could try HOn30 on your HO scale track and see if you like it. You know, you might decide you want to switch then. The only thing is, watch out for HO tunnels when running an HOn30 locomotive through it. I made that mistake. Okay, that's the end. I hope I didn't bore you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Beautiful work, Phil.
Thank you.
All right, guys, that wraps it up. We'll see you online and in Groups IO.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks,
Thank you
Fred.
Very much.
See you guys.
Thanks for having me.